Welcome to Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lovers all around the world. Miss Marple and Murder Among the Apples. Chapter 1. Arrival in Brambleford. The little bus from Market Latch wheezed as it climbed the last hill, and Miss Jane Marple, neat as a pin in her dove-grey coat, watched the fields slide past like pages in a story she remembered from long ago. It was early autumn, the kind that still pretends to be summer in the sunshine, but gives itself away in the evening chill. The hedges were thick with hips and haws. Beyond them, Brambleford lay in a soft hollow, its cottages and roofs stitched together by the long green of the orchards. The bus stopped with a sigh. Miss Marple stepped down with her small case and her knitting bag, and was immediately embraced by Dorothy Pell. Dorothy had been a lively girl once and was still handsome, but grief had drawn fine lines round her mouth, and her eyes were the colour of faded cornflowers. She wore a stout wool coat and gardening gloves tucked into her belt in a way that suggested she had come straight from giving orders. "My dear Jane," Dorothy said, kissing the air beside her cheek, "you look exactly as you did when you corrected my French verbs and told me not to trust men who whistle." "I don't remember being so unkind," Miss Marple said, smiling, "but I dare say it was sound advice." They walked together down the lane, the bus rumbling away behind them. Dorothy's house, Orchard House, stood at the end like a comfortable, well-bred dog, rambling and loyal, with a warm red brick face and a door that seemed to invite confidences. The orchard stretched behind in neat ranks. The trees were heavy with fruit, and the air had that pleasant, clean smell of apples in the sun. "You've come just in time for the harvest fair," Dorothy said. "It's tomorrow on the green. You will judge the apple pies, won't you? You always had such a good eye for pastry." "I have a better eye for character," Miss Marple said, "but pastry tells one quite a lot too." Dorothy's hand tightened on her arm before she could make a joke of it. "Then you'll see I'm not making a fuss over nothing. Things have been odd." "Odd is a useful word," Miss Marple said. "It covers a great many sins. Let us have tea first, and speak of them in order." Tea was laid in a cheerful sitting room that might have been designed to comfort. There was a fire already, although the afternoon was mild, and a fat tortoise-shell cat arranged itself at once upon Miss Marple's lap, as if they were old friends. A young woman came in with the tray, a spare, competent-looking person with rolled-up sleeves and flower on her wrist. "This is Nancy Blythe," Dorothy said, "our orchard manager. She knows everything and everyone, and she doesn't put up with nonsense." Nancy nodded to Miss Marple in a matter-of-fact way. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. Cream first or jam?" "Cream first is a Cornish habit, and jam first is Devon, I believe," Miss Marple replied. "But I find it best to follow the rule of the house." Nancy's mouth twitched. "Then it's cream after, miss. We're a sensible household." They were not 2 scones into the conversation when a tall, fair man came in as if the room belonged to him. He had the easy grin of a person who relies on charm to pay bills. Behind him fluttered a pretty woman with sleek, dark hair and an expensive scarf tied carelessly at her throat, scarlet with a pattern of golden leaves. "Mother," the man said, "we heard the bus. Is this the famous Miss Marple?" "This," said Dorothy in a tone that kept the peace while also placing everyone where they ought to be, "is my old friend Jane. Jane, my stepson, Harold, and his wife, Marjorie." "How do you do?" Marjorie said with the smile of someone who is bored but knows how to act otherwise. She had lovely hands and rather hard eyes. One finger wore a new ring, and the cat, which had excellent instincts, left Miss Marple's lap and stepped neatly out of Marjorie's reach. "I always thought Miss was wasted on women," Harold said, helping himself to a plate. "Sounds like a schoolmistress, eh?" "Not that we don't need schoolmistresses. Many do, I suppose." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "I find people who say we and mean others often need schooling the most." Harold laughed as if she had paid him a compliment. He was handsome in a slightly smudged way, like a picture someone had handled too often. Marjorie's scarf caught the light when she turned her head. It was very bright. It said, without speaking, that Marjorie liked to be seen. Dorothy poured more tea. "Jane, I must tell you about the will before it comes out sideways. My late husband left the orchards to Harold, which is sensible enough, but he left me control, full control, until my death. I am to run things as I see fit." Miss Marple nodded. "A common arrangement. It keeps boys from selling the silver when they are young and repentant when they are old." Harold pretended to be wounded. "I say, I've not sold anything except cider to paying customers." "Then that is well," Miss Marple said mildly. She took another scone and Dorothy went on. "It should all be easy," Dorothy said. "We pick, we press, we sell, but in the last month tools have been mislaid, good ones. Wire cutters went missing for 3 days and then turned up in a hedge. Fences have been clipped, and last week there was a fire in the apple store, small, thank heaven, but deliberate. The inspector from the insurance came. He muttered about careless lanterns, but Nancy keeps the rules. She always has." Nancy, who had been standing quietly near the door, flushed a little. "I do, Mrs. Pell. There's no lantern left near the bins, not by me or mine." "I know," Dorothy said. "That's why I say it's odd." Marjorie set down her cup with a click. "Really, Dorothy? Accidents happen, and if the farm wants to modernize, well, accidents will happen less. I have an acquaintance who can get us into the better shops in Bristol and Bath, but the orchard needs to look like business, not hobby. New labels, new crates, and a proper salesman. One can't float on village charm." "Charm is like cider," Miss Marple said. "Very pleasant when real, poisonous when artificial." Harold laughed again. "That's awfully good." Dorothy did not laugh. "There is also a man," she said, turning to Miss Marple, "who keeps turning up with a motor van and a glossy manner, a cider merchant, Mr. Cedric Crowe. He says he can find us buyers that will make our heads spin. I find my head spins less than it once did." "Crowe," Nancy said shortly, "flies in, makes a noise, pecks at things and flies out again. We were managing before and we'll manage after." "You see the spirit here?" Harold said lightly, but a muscle twitched in his cheek. "I call it stubborn. Marjorie calls it charming. I call it expensive." Miss Marple observed them all with the mild, blue-eyed look that had deceived so many people. She saw how Dorothy's hands were steady but her mouth was tight, how Nancy's practical shoulders already bore the year's worry, how Harold had new cufflinks and a hole beginning in the heel of one shoe, how Marjorie's ring was not a wedding band but an indulgence. She saw the scarf and thought how easy it is to find one's way by a bright colour, and how sometimes people forget that. "Perhaps," she said, "a small walk would restore us before we say things we regret. One can think very well under trees. They are patient listeners." They went at once by a path behind the house. The afternoon had made up its mind to be fine. Leaves fell in little whispers. A thrush scolded them from a branch, and then, seeing Miss Marple, decided she was no threat, and went back to her business. Nancy moved ahead, efficient and spare, pointing with the end of a pencil. "Here's where the fence was cut last week, you see? New wire twisted on, crisp ends, not a worker's job. The lads wrapped them down tidy. Whoever did this tried to copy, but it's too clean." Miss Marple crouched, no small feat for an elderly lady, and looked. "Yes," she said softly. "Like a child who mimics his mother's handwriting. It goes right and it goes wrong. Neatness in the wrong place, very often a sign of deceit. A car came bouncing down the lane, the kind that implies money somewhere else and a keen interest in new tires here. It drew up by the gate, and a man in a light coat and hat sprang out as if he had rehearsed the movement. "Mrs. Pell, just the person I wanted." He had a pleasant face, a quick smile, and eyes that went round and collected small things. "Cedric Crowe, Crowe's Ciders, at your service. And this must be, family splendid, we must all pull together, eh? Harvest waits for no one." He swept off his hat and put it back just as quickly. "Mr. Crowe," Dorothy said, and her tone could have stopped a dog at 20 yards. "We are walking. If you have business, it can wait until morning." "Morning? Of course, I live for mornings," Mr. Crowe said, who had the air of living for any moment that got him what he wanted. "But since I'm here, just a word, to say I've had a note from a buyer in Bath who is, frankly, champing at the bit." He smiled at Marjorie. "You understand these things, I can tell, the modern touch, the future." Marjorie's smile answered before she spoke. "One must keep up, certainly." "We keep up by doing the work," Nancy said. Mr. Crowe's eyes flicked to Nancy and away. He had weighed her and found her no use. Miss Marple, who never weighed a person before listening, looked at him with interest. He wore a clean shirt of the sort women iron for men, and he carried a little notebook like a man who likes to be seen writing figures. There was a faint scent about him, something sharp and rather cheap, meant to suggest limes and only succeeding in announcing itself. A smear of something pale showed on his cuff, as if he had leaned against a barrel or a fresh-painted door. "Do you care for apples, Mr. Crowe?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "I have known people who sell things they don't like at all." "Madam," he said with a sweeping hand, "I adore them. They are England's gift to the world, the Pell's apples above all. And mark me," he struck the fence lightly with his glove, "these will fetch a price this year." "Then you must fetch yours elsewhere," Dorothy said, "until we send for you." Mr. Crowe's hat came off again, elegantly, and his eyes went round once more and collected what they could. They paused upon Marjorie's bright scarf, upon Harold's easy stance, upon the steady figure of Nancy, and upon Miss Marple, just long enough to decide she was a sweet old lady who would not trouble him. He left in a flourish, the car spitting a little gravel as it went. "Clever men are usually in a hurry," Miss Marple said. "It gives them away." "Gives them what?" Harold asked, amused. "Corners," Miss Marple said. "They cut them." They walked on. The apple store stood cool and whitewashed, its door mended where the fire had licked at it. Inside, the air was clear and clean. Miss Marple breathed in, and something in the scent made a small, neat knot tie itself in her mind. Nothing she could name, nothing anyone else would have noticed, only that the sweetness had a bitter echo, as if a pleasant face had smiled a shade too long. "I shall make the custards tonight," Dorothy said, as if to compensate for her own anxiety. "The judges always grumble that there isn't enough proper English pudding these days." "And you will win," Harold said, kissing her cheek with a lightness that did not quite touch the skin. "Our Dorothy always wins." "That depends on the judges," Marjorie said. Her tone made clear she preferred other contests. Peter Telford came up the path as they were leaving the store, a slim man in a shabby jacket with ink on his thumb. He taught at the school and kept an eye on everything without appearing to do so. "Mrs. Pell?" he said, lifting his hat. "Miss Marple." He had the courtesy to know her name already. Teachers often do. "I hope you are sleeping with your windows shut. There has been some foolishness again near the lower orchard. If it is boys, they will be dealt with. If it is not..." He did not finish. Teachers know when not to finish. "Thank you, Mr. Telford," Dorothy said. "I am too old for nonsense. "We are all too old for nonsense," Miss Marple said cheerfully, "which is why the young provide it." Peter smiled. His eyes, quick and thoughtful, went to the mended door of the store and then to Marjorie's scarf. "The fair will be lively tomorrow," he said. "Let us hope that is the worst of it." The day folded itself into evening with a neatness that pleased Miss Marple. Supper was plain and good. Harold talked too much about improvements and investments. Marjorie talked softly about labels and markets. Dorothy listened without agreeing. Nancy ate as if she meant to be up before the sun, and the cat, who knew on which side its bread was buttered, placed itself between Miss Marple and the fire. Much later, in the blue hour, Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window and watched the orchard darken. The rows of trees were black lace against a sky that remembered daylight. Somewhere, a barn owl floated quite silently and then dropped out of sight. Beyond the garden wall, a small light moved for a moment, just a single bobbing glow, and then winked out. Miss Marple listened. She heard, as she had heard very often in St. Mary Mead, the sound of a gate latch lifted with care by a person who had learned to make little noises, mean less. She blew out her candle and got into bed. Her bones, which had carried her pleasantly all day, spoke in whispers. The whisper they made now was not of pain, but of warning. She lay very still, and because she believed in small things, she told herself firmly that most worries will look better after a cup of tea and 3 hours' sleep. "Odd," she murmured to the darkness, using the word that had begun the day's trouble. "Very odd indeed." Outside, the apples shone coldly in the moonlight, like coins laid on a table by someone who has not yet shown his hand. Chapter 2. The Harvest Fair. The morning broke bright and sharp, with a low mist crouching in the hollows and a faint smell of wood smoke drifting through Brambleford. By the time Miss Marple came down to breakfast, the kitchen was alive with movement. Dorothy was putting on her hat with a determined set to her chin. Marjorie was fastening a brooch shaped like a maple leaf, and Harold was leaning in the doorway with his coffee as if fairs were an ordeal rather than a pleasure. Nancy Blythe was already gone to oversee the loading of the orchard's best produce into the cart for the fairground. Miss Marple noted the absence with interest. People who rise early often see what others miss. "You'll enjoy this, Jane," Dorothy said briskly. "Every soul in Brambleford turns up for the fair, and a few from neighbouring villages too. It's the one day we all pretend we like each other." Miss Marple smiled. Pretense is often more revealing than honesty. The green at the centre of Brambleford had been transformed overnight. Stalls lined the edges, each decked with bunting, while the air was rich with the mingled scents of roasting chestnuts, sugared apples, and cider fresh from the press. Children darted between the crowd with paper flags, and the brass band played with an enthusiasm that made up for occasional wrong notes. Dorothy's stall stood near the church gate, piled high with apples polished to a soft gleam. There were russets, golden pippins, and deep crimson beauties that looked as if they had been painted. Nancy was behind the table, her sleeves rolled, and a light of pride in her eye. She greeted Miss Marple with a nod before turning to serve a customer. "I'll see to the pies," Dorothy said, bustling off toward the judging tent. Harold, apparently bored, wandered toward a stall selling hunting prints. Marjorie lingered by the cider tasting table, where Mr. Cedric Crowe was in his element. He was telling a small knot of villagers about his connections in Bath, his voice carrying easily over the music. Miss Marple strolled toward the judging tent, observing, "Fairs are ideal places for watching without being noticed, too much bustle for anyone to keep track of everyone else." She saw Peter Telford speaking quietly with the vicar near the tombola. His expression was serious, and his gaze kept drifting toward Marjorie and Crowe. Inside the judging tent, the long trestle tables were crowded with entries, jars of chutney, stacks of scones, and more apple pies than one could sensibly eat in a week. The head judge, Mr. Lawrence Biddle, was a man of solemn habits and thick spectacles. He greeted Miss Marple with old-fashioned courtesy and offered her a fork. "Mrs. Pell's pies are always among the best," he confided, "but competition is fierce this year. That new housekeeper at the vicarage has a way with pastry." Miss Marple sampled, nodding appreciatively. When Dorothy's turn came, the crust was perfect, golden, flaky, with a faint gloss that spoke of experience. The filling was sweet but not cloying, with just enough cinnamon to warm the tongue. Before she could comment, Nancy appeared in the doorway. She had no business in the tent, but she stood just inside, scanning the crowd with a look of quiet concern. Spotting Miss Marple, she made a small, beckoning gesture. Excusing herself, Miss Marple joined her. "It's Mrs. Pell," Nancy murmured. "She's been offered a mug of cider by Crow. I poured it away when she wasn't looking. There was a taste I didn't like. Sharp, bitter, not the usual batch." "You're sure?" Miss Marple asked. Nancy's eyes were steady. "I know our cider. This wasn't ours." They returned to the stall together. Dorothy was none the wiser, chatting with a couple from the next village. Marjorie was at Crow's elbow, laughing at something he said. His notebook peeked from his pocket, and Miss Marple caught a flash of smudged writing, numbers, perhaps, or names. The pie contest concluded with predictable results. Dorothy won first place. The announcement drew warm applause, though Miss Marple noticed Marjorie's clapping was perfunctory. Crow made a show of congratulating Dorothy, promising to introduce her to serious buyers. Nancy kept her eyes on the stall, saying nothing. The afternoon wore on with the comfortable rhythm of village life, raffles, children's races, and the brass band marching in a small, uneven circle. Clouds drifted in, softening the light. Somewhere behind the cider press, Miss Marple overheard Harold in low conversation with a stranger in a brown coat. Their words were muffled by the band's music, but she caught the phrase, "Sell now, before it's too late." By 4 o'clock, the crowd had begun to thin, the stalls packed up slowly, reluctant to let go of the day. Dorothy was collecting the last of her apples when Crow reappeared, his smile just as quick as before. "I'll be by the orchard tomorrow, Mrs. Pell," he said. "I've got news you'll want to hear." "Tomorrow then?" Dorothy replied, though her tone suggested no enthusiasm. Miss Marple was about to follow Dorothy when she noticed Peter Telford standing apart, watching Crow leave. His gaze was sharp, almost accusatory. When he turned, he met Miss Marple's eyes and gave a small nod, as though acknowledging a shared awareness. That evening, the household returned to Orchard House, tired but satisfied. Supper was eaten in near silence, everyone worn out from the fair. Afterward, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting, reflecting on the day's impressions. Nancy's warning about the cider troubled her. The bitterness could be an accident, but it could also be deliberate. Crow's persistent interest in the orchard, Harold's whispered conversation, Marjorie's alignment with the outsider, all small threads, but threads have a way of tangling into knots. As she turned these thoughts over, Dorothy joined her with a cup of tea. "It was a good day, Jane," she said, "but I can't shake the feeling something's coming. Cedric Crow doesn't give up easily." Miss Marple laid her knitting in her lap. "My dear Dorothy, sometimes it is not the giving up that matters, but the taking. We must watch, quietly. People reveal themselves when they think no one is looking." Outside, the orchard lay under the first stars, its rows still and shadowed. Somewhere among those trees, Miss Marple felt certain, a secret was waiting, one that would not stay hidden for long. Chapter 3. A Body Among the Trees. The following morning dawned still and pale, with a faint mist curling low between the orchard rows. Miss Marple was up early, drawn by the sound of voices outside her window. She moved the curtains slightly and saw Nancy speaking in low tones to one of the younger orchard hands, the boy shifting uneasily from foot to foot. Nancy pointed toward the far edge of the orchard, her expression grave. By the time Miss Marple reached the kitchen, Dorothy had her coat on. "There's been an accident," she said tightly. "Nancy's found someone in the orchard. It's Cedric Crow." They set off together, boots wet with dew. The air in the orchard was heavy with the scent of ripening apples, but as they neared the last row, the pleasant aroma gave way to something more metallic. A cluster of workers stood silent, caps in hand, their faces set. Crow lay on his back beneath the wide branches of an old apple tree, one arm flung out at an odd angle. His hat was gone, his hair matted with blood from a deep wound at the temple. Just beyond his hand, half hidden in the grass, lay an orchard hook, the curved metal glinting faintly in the morning light. Inspector Fenton was already there, young and brisk, his notebook open. "Struck from above, I'd say," he remarked, as though solving a puzzle on a blackboard. "Blow was heavy, immediate, no signs of a struggle." He glanced at Dorothy. "You knew the man?" "Only in business matters," Dorothy replied. "He wasn't welcome here without invitation." Miss Marple bent to adjust the edge of Crow's coat, careful not to disturb anything. A faint, sticky residue clung to the fabric, cider by the smell. The sleeve was darkened as if something had been spilled hours before. She also noticed a scrap of bright cloth snagged on a branch overhead, the weave fine and the color a striking scarlet. She made no comment, only tucked the observation into the quiet file of her mind. Fenton crouched by the body, scribbling. "Wallet's gone, pockets otherwise untouched, likely a robbery." Nancy spoke up sharply. "No one robs a man in broad daylight and leaves him lying in the Pell orchard. Whoever did this wanted it seen." Harold appeared at the edge of the group, looking unshaven and drawn. "I heard shouting. What's happened?" His eyes flicked to the body, then away just as quickly. "Mr. Crow has been killed," Fenton said. "When did you last see him?" Harold hesitated. "Yesterday afternoon, on the green, we spoke briefly." Marjorie arrived a moment later, her scarf missing, but her lipstick carefully applied. She clutched her handbag and looked from face to face, her voice pitched high. "This is dreadful. Who could possibly—" "People will say what they will," Nancy cut in. "Best to have your answers ready." Fenton straightened. "We'll need statements from everyone. No one is to leave the property until I say so." By mid-morning, Crow's body had been taken away, leaving only the trampled grass and the orchard hook marked with a chalk circle. The workers returned to their tasks, though their usual chatter was gone, replaced by watchful silence. Dorothy retreated to the kitchen, where Miss Marple found her staring at the untouched breakfast table. "This will bring trouble," Dorothy said quietly. "Crow had a way of making enemies, but this feels close to home." Miss Marple poured tea for them both. "Close to home is where most trouble begins," she said. "People speak of strangers, but I find familiarity more dangerous. It grants access and motive." Later that day, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the orchard alone. The scene of the crime felt different now, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. She examined the branch where the cloth had caught. It was high enough that a person would have to climb or use a ladder to reach it. Beneath it, the grass showed two distinct patches of flattened earth, one where Crow had fallen, another where someone had clearly stood watching. She also noted the absence of any obvious cider barrel nearby. The scent on Crow's sleeve puzzled her. It was strong, fresh, yet none of the orchard hands reported working with cider in that part of the grove that morning. From the corner of her eye, she saw Peter Telford approaching. "Mrs. Pell asked me to keep an eye on the workers," he said. "Some of them are frightened, others are whispering about bad luck." "Superstition is a convenient veil," Miss Marple replied. "It covers what people do not wish to examine too closely." Peter hesitated. "Crow came to see me yesterday, wanted information about the orchard's accounts. I told him to speak to Mrs. Pell directly, but he seemed urgent. I didn't like the look in his eye." "Urgency can be the shadow of fear," Miss Marple said gently. "Or greed. Sometimes both." In the afternoon, Fenton returned with more questions. He had the air of a man convinced of his own theory. "Robbery," he declared. "Plain and simple. Someone knew Crow carried cash, took it. End of story." "And the scrap of cloth?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Likely torn from a jacket or scarf during the scuffle," Fenton said. "We'll match it soon enough." Miss Marple nodded without argument. She had learned long ago that pointing out flaws in a tidy theory only made its owner defensive. Far better to let the facts speak when the time came. That evening, the household gathered in the drawing room, each person carrying their own unease. Harold drank his cider quickly, avoiding eye contact. Marjorie sat with her knitting untouched, glancing toward the window whenever footsteps passed outside. Dorothy kept her place by the fire, the lines in her face deepened. Nancy entered quietly, carrying a small folded paper. "Found this near the lower gate," she said, handing it to Dorothy. The note was brief. "Stop asking questions. Next time it won't be Crow." Miss Marple's eyes flicked from the paper to each face in the room. Fear is easy to spot. It tightens the shoulders and narrows the gaze. But guilt is subtler. It hides in stillness, in the careful arrangement of one's hands, in the deliberate effort not to look. She tucked away the knowledge without a word. There would be time yet to follow those threads. Time, and perhaps one or two more mistakes from the guilty. Outside, the mist was rising again, folding the orchard into a grey curtain. Somewhere within that curtain lay the truth, and Miss Marple intended to draw it back piece by piece. Chapter 4. A Tangle of Motives. Inspector Fenton returned the next morning, a thin folder under his arm and a look that suggested he thought the matter nearly wrapped up. Miss Marple, watching from the sitting-room window, suspected otherwise. Men who arrive with their conclusions in place rarely leave with the right answers. Dorothy opened the door to him, her expression polite but cool. "I'll need to speak to everyone again," Fenton announced. "Some statements don't quite align." "Statements," Dorothy repeated. "Or stories?" Fenton gave her a look that suggested the distinction mattered less to him than it did to her. The interviews began in the dining room. Harold was called in first. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in the corner with her knitting, observed closely. Harold wore a fresh shirt, but his hair was slightly rumpled, as if he'd dressed in haste. "You argued with Mr. Crow on the green," Fenton said without preamble. "What about?" "Business," Harold replied smoothly. "He wanted to push Mother into some flashy distribution deal. I told him it wasn't his decision." "And after that?" "I went home. Marjorie will confirm." Fenton's pencil tapped the page. "Any dealings with him yesterday evening?" Harold's gaze slid sideways for a fraction of a second, toward the window, not at his wife. "No." Miss Marple noted that answer down in her mind alongside the pause before it. Pauses often held more truth than words. Marjorie was next, her scarf back around her neck, green this time. The change in colour felt deliberate. She sat with her hands folded neatly. "You were seen speaking with Mr. Crow at the cider stall," Fenton said. "I was merely being polite," Marjorie replied. "He had interesting ideas for marketing, nothing more." "Were you near the orchard yesterday evening?" "Of course not," she said quickly, then smiled as though softening the denial. "I was here with Harold." Miss Marple saw the faintest tightening in her jaw as she said it, a tightening that didn't speak of affection, but of calculation. Peter Telford entered next, his jacket carrying the faint scent of chalk dust from the school. "I told you before," he said to Fenton. "Crow came to me for information. I refused. I had no reason to see him again." "Where were you after sunset?" Fenton asked. "At home marking papers. Alone, unfortunately." "And the papers?" Peter's brow lifted. "Still on my desk if you'd care to check." Miss Marple suspected the young inspector would not. Evidence that required walking to fetch seldom found its way into a report. Nancy's turn brought a change in the room's air. She entered with her chin high, meeting Fenton's gaze without flinching. "You told Mrs. Pell about the cider yesterday," he said. "What made you suspicious?" "It wasn't ours," Nancy replied simply. "I could smell the difference, and Crow was the one offering it." Fenton scribbled. "Could you have mixed up the barrels?" "No," her voice was firm. "And if you're asking whether I had reason to harm him, yes, I did. He owed me money for a bulk order last winter. Never paid, but I'm not in the habit of killing debtors." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Debtors are more useful alive," she observed. "They may yet pay." Nancy's mouth twitched. "Exactly." When the interviews ended, Fenton declared he had several promising leads and left. Dorothy went to the kitchen, Harold disappeared to the study, and Marjorie retreated upstairs. That left Miss Marple free to step out into the orchard. The crime scene was quieter now. The chalk marks were gone, but the grass still bore the imprint of the body. Overhead, the branch that had snagged the scarlet cloth swayed gently in the breeze. Miss Marple examined the bark, faint scuff marks from a boot sole. Someone had climbed up, or perhaps braced themselves against the trunk to position the hook. At the far edge of the orchard, near the boundary hedge, she found a small object half hidden under leaves, a fragment of glass. She held it to the light, green-tinted with a faint smell of cider. Not from the orchard's own stock, the Pells bottled in brown glass. She was still considering this when Peter Telford appeared along the path. "You're looking for something," he said, not unkindly. "I find things tend to appear when one's eyes are open," Miss Marple replied. He hesitated, then said, "I heard someone moving in the orchard that night, before Crow's body was found, but I didn't see who, just a shadow near the lower gate." "That's useful," Miss Marple said. "Shadows tell you where the light was, and sometimes where it wasn't meant to be." Peter gave a small, puzzled smile. "Do you think the inspector's right about robbery?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that people often prefer simple answers to complicated truths." Back at the house, she found Dorothy in the kitchen with a stack of account books spread before her. "These are the orchard's ledgers," Dorothy said. "Crow wanted to see them. I refused." Miss Marple glanced at the columns of figures. "Are they accurate?" "Yes, but if someone wanted to make them appear otherwise, well, it wouldn't be difficult. Crow hinted there were discrepancies. I don't know where he got that idea." "Rumour is as much a weapon as any hook," Miss Marple murmured. That evening, Harold emerged from the study just as Marjorie descended the stairs. Their eyes met for a brief second, too brief for warmth, too quick for comfort. Miss Marple saw it and thought of the scarlet scarf, the boot scuffs on the apple tree, and the green-tinted glass fragment in her pocket. Nancy came in from the yard carrying a crate. "Lower gate was unlatched," she reported. Again. Dorothy's lips pressed together. "That gate stays shut unless someone means otherwise." Miss Marple poured herself tea, her mind knitting together threads as deftly as her fingers worked wool. The orchard was full of apples, but it was people's lives and lies that would make the true harvest. Chapter 5. Whispers and Red Herrings. Rain came in the night, leaving the orchard glistening and the lanes patched with puddles. Miss Marple rose early, drawn to the muffled hum of voices drifting from the kitchen. She paused just outside the door, listening. Nancy was speaking in a low, urgent tone. "I'm telling you, Mrs. Pell, someone's moving apples out in the dark, not our orders. I counted 3 bins short this morning." Dorothy's reply was weary but steady. "Check the accounts again. If it's true, we'll have to confront them." Miss Marple stepped in with a mild good morning and took her seat at the table. She asked no questions. Experience had taught her that people will volunteer more when they think you haven't heard. The day began with an unexpected visitor. A tall man in a worn raincoat knocked at the back door, introducing himself as George Pym, a cider broker from Devon. His eyes were quick, his manner brisk. "I was meant to meet Mr. Crow yesterday," he said. "We had business to discuss." Dorothy's mouth tightened. "Mr. Crow won't be keeping appointments?" "Yes," Pym said shortly. "I heard. Shame that. He was sniffing around a deal I've been trying to close. If it's still open, I'd rather deal with you directly." Miss Marple noticed how he avoided looking at Nancy, though she stood squarely beside the door. A man avoiding eye contact often has a history with the person in his periphery. By mid-morning, Inspector Fenton was back, stomping mud from his boots. He announced to Dorothy and Harold that a neighbour had reported seeing a woman in a bright scarf near the orchard on the night of Crow's death. The inspector's gaze slid toward Marjorie as he spoke. Marjorie smiled thinly. "I own many scarves, Inspector. Half the village could claim the same in one colour or another." "Not quite as distinctive as yours," Fenton said. Miss Marple, who sat quietly in the corner, watched the exchange with interest. Marjorie's poise was intact, but her fingers tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm on the arm of her chair. Less nervousness, more calculation. After Fenton left, Miss Marple decided on a stroll through the village. The high street was busy, the rain-washed air carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. At the post office, she overheard 2 women discussing the murder. "They say Crow was poking about in people's accounts," one whispered. "And that someone here was in debt to him," the other replied. "If you ask me, that's motive enough." Miss Marple tucked the tidbit away. Debts had a way of drawing invisible lines between people, lines that could pull tight at the wrong moment. Back at Orchard House, she found Peter Telford waiting in the parlour. "I've been thinking," he said. "Crow was making notes that day on the green. I saw him write something just before he came to speak to me." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did you see what?" "Only part of a name." And then he closed the notebook. Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "It could be many things." Peter hesitated. "Could be Marjorie, but it could also be someone else entirely." That afternoon, Nancy returned from the lower orchard with an odd discovery. A pair of gloves, wet from the rain, tucked into a hollow in the hedge. They were women's gloves, cream-coloured kid leather, the right one with a faint streak of what looked like rust. Nancy handed them to Dorothy, but Miss Marple caught the quick flicker in Harold's eyes when he saw them. Rust can be a convincing disguise for blood, she thought. Evening brought an uneasy quiet to the house. Dorothy kept to her study with account books, Marjorie claimed a headache and remained upstairs, and Harold paced between rooms. Nancy worked late in the barn, the light from her lamp spilling out into the dark. Miss Marple, sitting in the drawing room, caught a glimpse of movement outside, a shadow passing the lower garden wall. She rose quietly and went to the side door. From there, she saw Harold slipping out toward the orchard, his coat collar turned up. He paused at the gate, glancing over his shoulder, before disappearing between the rows. She did not follow yet. Sometimes it was more useful to let a person believe they hadn't been seen. An hour later, Harold returned, empty-handed but with damp trousers at the cuffs. He looked startled to find Miss Marple still awake. "Couldn't sleep?" he said quickly. "Thought a walk might clear my head." "In the orchard?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Fresh air," he replied, and left it at that. And she let him go. Answers given too quickly often deserved more time to ripen. The night closed in with a hush, broken only by the steady drip of rain from the eaves. Upstairs, Miss Marple made a small note in her travel diary. "Too many hands in the barrel." The apples are going missing, but the rot began before the harvest. She extinguished her lamp, knowing that by morning more whispers would come, and perhaps a clue bold enough to be mistaken for something else entirely. Chapter 6. The Cider Barrel. The rain had rinsed the world clean, leaving the barn smelling of damp wood and apples. Nancy Blythe stood by the third row of barrels, frowning at one that did not belong. It sat a little too proudly, its hoop brighter than the rest, the bung newly sealed with a neat white cap of wax. When she pressed her ear to the staves, her expression changed. She went straight to the house. "Mrs. Pell, Miss Marple, could you come to the barn a moment?" Dorothy followed at once. Miss Marple came more slowly, noting details as she always did. In the barn's soft half-light, the odd barrel was easy to spot even if you knew nothing about barrels. It had been wiped, for one thing. The others wore a fine bloom of dust that comes from honest work. This one was as clean as a show pony. Nancy rapped it with her knuckles. "Hear that?" A faint sound answered, tick, 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 like a watch wrapped in a drawer. Dorothy blinked. "Is that—" "It is," Nancy said, "and it's not right." Miss Marple touched the wax with the tip of a fingernail. It yielded slightly, not yet hardened, to the dull firmness of old seals. A tiny crescent came away on her nail, snow-white against her skin. "Fetch Inspector Fenton," Dorothy said, "and mind the men keep their distance." Fenton arrived with a constable and the air of a man glad to be summoned. He took in the scene, squared his shoulders and said, "Stand back all." He had the bung eased out with care. Sweet cider breath rose at once, along with the brisk ticking of a small clock wrapped in a torn handkerchief. Nestled beside it, caught between stave and cloth, lay a wallet. The leather was swollen, and the banknotes within bled their ink into the cider like bruises. "Cedric Crowe's, I expect," Fenton said, already pleased. He flipped it open, showed a card, and nodded. "Well then, robbery confirmed. The thief hid the takings here, meaning to fetch them later." "Not takings," Nancy said evenly. "That's Crowe's private wallet, not our money. And this barrel is from the wrong row. We never seal with white wax." "Perhaps you should," Fenton returned. "It shows tampering plainly." Miss Marple did not argue. She kept her eyes on small things. The wax crumbs caught in a hoop groove, the faint scuff on the barn floor where the barrel had been rolled from elsewhere, the chalk marking on the head rubbed out and written over. Beneath the new NB6, she could just see the ghost of an earlier set of initials, HP. She tucked that away. Harold and Marjorie arrived on the constable's heels. Harold went a shade grey when he saw the wallet. Marjorie's gaze moved fast, taking in the clock, the handkerchief, the softened banknotes. "Who put that there?" she asked. It sounded like a question. It felt like a performance. Fenton pointed his pencil. "Someone with access. Barn keyholders are Mrs. Pell and Miss Blythe, yes?" Nancy's chin rose. "And yourself since yesterday, Inspector. You had it to check the locks, remember?" Fenton flushed. "Don't be impertinent, Miss Blythe." Dorothy stepped forward. Impertinent or not, she is correct. The keys are accounted for, and no one moves barrels in my barn without my knowing, unless they do it after dark and with the lights kept low. Then we'll find who, Fenton said. For now, this confirms motive. Crow was struck, his wallet taken, the money hidden. Someone here feared being found with it. Miss Marple thought, or someone here wished us to think so. Aloud, she said only, "It is a very tidy picture, Inspector. Tidy pictures sometimes have missing corners." When the official bustle had moved outside, Miss Marple lingered by the barrel. She sniffed the bunghole once more. Fresh cider, yes, but with a slight tang out of keeping with the orchard's usual brew, something sharper like the smell she had caught on Mr. Crow's cuff. She looked along the rack, brown bottles stacked in crates marked Pell. On a lower shelf, forgotten, a stray green bottle lay on its side, its neck chipped. "Mrs. Pell?" she called. "Do you have a bottle in green?" "Never," Dorothy said. "Brown keeps the light off. My husband swore by it." Miss Marple picked up the green bottle and caught the light on the floor. A shard was missing. She remembered the fragment she had found beneath the hedge. So then, Peter Telford appeared in the doorway, breath misting faintly in the cool air. "I saw the inspector's car," he said. "Is it true about the wallet?" "I'm afraid so," Dorothy replied. Peter's eyes travelled to the clock ticking beside it. He smiled without warmth. "A stage trick, that. Make a noise so the audience looks where you want. We used to hide alarm clocks in the cloakroom at school. Nasty little joke that was." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "And did you choose where to hide them according to who you wished blamed?" Peter coloured. "We were young and stupid." "Both conditions are not only found in youth," Miss Marple said, and let him off the hook with a small smile. Fenton took statements again, sharper this time. He pressed Nancy about the keys, Dorothy about her control of the estate, Harold about his comings and goings. At Harold's turn, something slipped. "I suppose you'll now say I killed him for debt," he snapped. "Debt?" Fenton pounced. "What debt?" Harold flinched at his own word. "A private arrangement, that's all. Crow advanced money for new labels, our new line. We were to repay after the Bath buyers." He swallowed. "It's business." "Business paid in cash and hidden in barrels," Fenton said. "It's motive, Mr. Pell. That's what it is." Marjorie's hand touched her husband's sleeve, light as a moth. "Don't say anything else, dear. It only feeds rumours." Her voice was gentle. Her eyes were cold. Miss Marple, watching, thought of bright scarves and the way attention follows theatre. In the afternoon, Miss Marple went to the stationer's on the high street under pretext of a new pencil. The proprietor, who did not know how to be discreet, chatted about the fair and the murder, and how people were buying sealing wax again, like the old days. "Had a run on it yesterday," he said cheerfully. "White, red, even a box of green I thought would never go. Mrs. Pell bought none, but your pretty daughter-in-law asked after colours, said she fancied changing her letters." Miss Marple paid for her pencil and made a small noise to indicate interest and nothing more. Colours were useful. They drew the eye, white on a bung, green in a bottle, scarlet in a tree. On her way back, she met the vicar, who mentioned, as vicars do, the weather and the harvest, and incidentally that George Pym had been seen at the inn asking curious questions about the Pell orchard. "He did not attend church," the vicar added, as if that settled his character. "He left early this morning." "People often leave early when they have gathered what they came for," Miss Marple said. At dusk, the barn grew solemn. Miss Marple returned there alone, taking with her a little travel clock from Dorothy's drawer and a length of soft cloth. She set the clock ticking and wrapped it, then placed it inside the empty crate nearest the door. She walked to the far end of the barn and listened. Very faintly, there it was, tick, tick, just at the edge of hearing. In the row where the odd barrel had sat, the sound carried more clearly along the wood and hoops. "Sound travels in company," she murmured, "like gossip." She put the clock away and turned the lamp down. When she stepped out into the yard, the evening was cool and clear. A hare moved like a shadow toward the hedge. From the lower gate came the soft creak of a latch. She crossed to it, as if simply enjoying the air. The gate stood half closed, the latch lifted and set down with too much care. Miss Marple knelt, easing an old hand to the sill. There, caught in a splinter, was a strip of coarse twine, dyed a peculiar blue-green. Not the twine Dorothy used, which was a dull brown, nor Nancy's, which was pale. She worried it free and wound it round a fingertip. A sliver of card lay in the damp earth at the post's base. She lifted it with a hairpin. The print had run, but the top of a letter remained in strong black ink. Shh. "Ashcombe and Sons," she said softly, remembering a rival name she had heard muttered at the fair. Someone had been moving apples through this gate at night. Someone had also staged a scene in the barn to point the finger at the nearest pair of hands. Miss Marple stood a long moment, listening to the orchard breathing in the dark. Men like Inspector Fenton adored tidy answers. Men like Mr. Crow liked to make a mess and call it business. And there were others, quieter, cleverer, who counted on both sorts to miss what was under their noses. She slipped the twine and the card into her pocket and went back to the house. In the hall mirror, she caught her own reflection, small, neat, unremarkable. People rarely looked twice at her. That was their mistake, and sometimes their undoing. Dorothy met her at the drawing-room door. "Tea?" she asked, though it was late for it. "Tea is a comfort at any hour," Miss Marple said. "And we shall need our comforts. Someone has gone to a lot of trouble to arrange barrels and clocks and wax. Too much trouble for a simple thief." Dorothy's hand trembled a little as she poured. "Will you find them, Jane?" "I don't know if I shall," Miss Marple answered truthfully. "But they will help me, I think. People who arrange tableaux always leave the wrong prop in the right place." She smiled a small, crisp smile. "And barrels, my dear, keep better secrets than people, but not forever." Chapter 7. An Unexpected Confession. The morning broke with a brittle frost, the orchard silvered under a pale sun. Miss Marple took her tea by the kitchen window, watching Nancy and 2 labourers check the lower gate. Their movements were careful, deliberate, almost too deliberate, as if they were conscious of being watched. Dorothy entered with a letter in hand. "From George Pym," she said. "He claims Crow promised him a share in some cider shipment, apples from here. He wants to know who will honour the agreement now." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "The dead are remarkably obliging when used as witnesses, my dear. They cannot correct anyone's story." Inspector Fenton arrived before noon, a fresh determination in his manner. "I've been questioning at the inn," he told Dorothy. "Pym's name comes up more than I'd like. But it's not just him. Your son-in-law here has been seen meeting him. Harold, lounging by the parlour fire, straightened at once." "Business, Inspector, and if you're implying—" "I'm stating facts," Fenton cut in. "Crow dies, his wallet turns up in your barn, you've got debts, and now you're dealing with his rival." Marjorie's voice sliced through. "Perhaps you should look elsewhere. Pym isn't the only one with something to lose." Fenton's gaze flicked to her. "And what did you lose, Mrs. Pell?" Marjorie's lips curved, but not in a smile. "Time. Crow wasted mine." Miss Marple knitted quietly, her needles steady. She had learned that silence in a heated room was like a bell, Sooner or later, it drew every ear. Sure enough, Harold glanced her way, eyes narrowed, as if wondering what she knew. After Fenton left, Miss Marple took a slow walk into the orchard. The frost still clung in shaded hollows, each blade of grass rimmed in white. Near the tree where Crow had fallen, she found Nancy stacking empty crates. "Thought you'd be keeping warm," Nancy said. "I like to see things in all their seasons," Miss Marple replied. "It changes the way they speak." Nancy gave her a sidelong look. "And what are the trees telling you today?" "That they keep company with more than one kind of thief." Back at the house, Dorothy was sorting through an old box of household papers. She held up an envelope, its seal broken. This was in the desk drawer, not mine, addressed to Harold. Miss Marple read the first lines, a demand for repayment from Cedric Crow. The sum was not small, and the date was just 3 days before his death. "Harold will say it's business," Dorothy said grimly. "But it's a noose, Jane. Crow could pull it whenever he wished." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "Some debts are paid in coin, others in silence. Both can be deadly." That evening, as the family gathered for supper, an interruption came from the hallway. Peter Telford, pale and agitated, asking to see Mrs. Pell at once. In the drawing room, with the fire crackling behind him, Peter spoke without preamble. "I need to tell you the truth. I found Crow's body before Nancy did. I moved him." Dorothy stared. "Why?" "I'd been following him," Peter admitted. "I wanted to know what he was doing in the orchard after dark. When I saw him lying there, I panicked. I thought if anyone knew I'd been here, they'd think I'd done it." "And the bright scarf?" Miss Marple asked softly. Peter blinked. "Scarf? I saw someone leaving by the lower gate. Wearing one, yes. But it wasn't Mrs. Pell, if that's what you're thinking. The figure was smaller, faster." Marjorie's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Harold glanced down at his plate. When Peter had gone, Dorothy poured herself a stiff brandy. "This is unravelling by the hour." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said. "Knots are loosening. We can begin to see the threads." She took her tea to the sitting room and sat in the quiet. The scarf, the green bottle, the twine, and the letter forming a pattern in her mind. Someone had tried very hard to lead suspicion in one direction. But the more elaborate the trail, the easier it was to trip over it. Just before bed, Nancy came to her. "Miss Marple, there's something you should know. I saw Marjorie in the barn the morning after Crow died. She was alone, no reason for her to be there." "Did she see you?" Miss Marple asked. "I don't think so, but she left in a hurry." Miss Marple looked into the firelight, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Nancy. That's very useful." In her room later, Miss Marple opened her diary and wrote only one line. The barrel was the stage. The scarf was the curtain. Now we wait for the final act. Chapter 8, Apples Never Lie. They gathered in the big barn because Miss Marple asked them to, and because there was a feeling that the orchard itself ought to hear the truth. The afternoon light ran in pale bars across the floor. Dust drifted like slow confetti. Dorothy stood very straight beside Nancy. Harold hovered near the door, restless, and Marjorie took a place where the light caught her cheekbones and left her eyes in soft shade. Inspector Fenton arrived last, brisk and certain, notebook ready as if the world would fall into it in an orderly fashion. Miss Marple was small against the stacked barrels, but the barn made a chapel of quiet around her. She folded her hands. "We've had a great deal of noise," she said pleasantly, "and very little sense. When that happens, I find it useful to put the pieces on the table in the right order. People call it deduction. I call it tidying." Fenton sniffed. "If this is about my robbery theory..." "It is about your clock," Miss Marple said, mild as milk, "and your wax, and your fondness for answers that come neatly wrapped." He shut his notebook with a little snap and tucked it under his arm. Miss Marple turned to the nearest barrel, the one that had worn the white sealing wax like a wedding cake. She tapped the hoop with a knuckle. "Someone placed Mr. Crow's wallet here, together with a ticking clock, to make us look. They sealed the bung with fresh white wax, to make us admire the seal. It was a tableau, Inspector. In a theatre, one calls it misdirection." Marjorie's smile was quick. "Anyone could have done that. The keys." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet not everyone buys white wax at the stationer's the day after a murder." She took a small slip of paper from her pocket. "Mr. Fairchild remembers you asking about colours, Mrs. Pell. Red was old-fashioned, you said. White was modern." Colour stirred in Marjorie's cheeks and then settled again. "I am not the only woman in Brambleford with taste." "No," Miss Marple said, "but you are the only one I can place in this barn alone that morning, seen by Miss Blythe. And the only one with a neat mind for presentation." Fenton cleared his throat. "Even if she did stage the barrel," he said, "that doesn't prove she killed Crow." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "The killing was done the night before under the old tree. The blow came from above. There are scuffs on the trunk where someone braced a foot. There's a scrap of scarlet silk snagged on a branch, silk of the sort you wear, Mrs. Pell." Mr. Telford saw a smaller figure leave by the lower gate, quick and light, in a bright scarf. Marjorie's hand rose, very delicately, to the green scarf at her throat, as if to assure it of its innocence. "You've built a story out of a thread," she said. "Not a thread," Miss Marple said gently. "A skein. There are the cream gloves left in the hedge after the rain, one streaked with what the inspector called rust. There is the stray green bottle under the rack and the shard I picked up by the boundary. The Pell's bottle in brown, yet Mr. Crow's sleeve smelled of cider, not our own. Yesterday, at the fair, someone offered him a bitter, sharp little taste in a green bottle. He didn't drink it, Miss Blythe tipped it away, but later that evening he met the same someone again and took a second sample to discuss terms. It spilled on his cuff when he fell. She looked at Nancy. "You saved him once. You couldn't save him twice." Nancy's jaw worked once and steadied. "I saw him talking to her behind the press," she said quietly. "I didn't hear words." Marjorie made a soft, incredulous sound. "We were discussing labels." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and also shipments. The lower gate told me so. The latch is lifted with care too often for mere carelessness, and the twine caught in the sill is dyed blue-green, the colour used by Ashcombe and Sons. They mark their crates with a blue-green cord. There was a card fragment by the post, Ash. Mr. Pym has been asking questions because apples have been walking out of this place at night, bound for his rival buyers. Only someone with a free hand in this house could manage that. A person who is not thought to rise early or work late. A person who has time for scarves and stationers." She inclined her head, courteous as ever. "That was you, Mrs. Pell?" Harold swung round. "Now see here, if anyone's been selling apples on the side, then you helped carry them," Miss Marple said, quite without malice. "You were out the night I saw you in the rain. Your cuff bottoms were wet. You went because your wife asked you to, and because you have the kind of pride that does not like to admit debt to another man. Mr. Crow held your note. He could ruin you with a letter, and he meant to." But Crow did not know whose game he was interrupting. He thought the siphoning was yours, Harold. It wasn't, it was hers. Harold stared at Marjorie, as if seeing a figure on a stage from a bad seat, all light and no detail. "Marge?" Marjorie's expression did not change. It was very beautiful, very still. "Jane's little stories do go on," she murmured. "They go on," Miss Marple agreed. because the truth must travel the long way round when someone keeps rearranging the furniture. You chose the tree, Mrs. Pell, because the branch is low enough to reach if one is nimble, and the scarf eye-catching enough to be admired. You arranged to meet Mr. Crow after dark and promised him a share if he stayed quiet about the shipments. He didn't agree. You climbed, or braced yourself, and swung the hook down. You laid the wallet to one side, thinking to make it look like robbery, and then in the morning you improved the scene. You rolled a barrel from Mr. Pell's row. See, the ghost of H.P. is still beneath the chalk, and scrawled Miss Blythe's mark over it, using that fashionable white wax to draw the inspector's eye, and the little clock to hurry his cleverness. Fenton flushed. "There's no need to be—" "Unkind?" Miss Marple smiled. "No, there never is. It isn't unkind to say you are quick, Inspector. It is only unfortunate that you are quick in the direction you happen to be pointing at the time." Marjorie laughed. "Bright, brittle. And your motive for me, Miss Marple? Vanity? Scarves? It's thin." "Money," Miss Marple said, and the word made a little hard place in the air. "Not vulgar money, the useful sort, capital for your new line, and an escape if Orchard House refused to modernize. You used Mr. Crow while he was useful. When he ceased to be, you silenced him. Then you painted the scene to throw us at Nancy first and Dorothy later. The warning note to Mrs. Pell after the body was found, 'Stop asking questions,' was meant to sound like a stranger's hand. It reads like a woman who writes quick letters and thinks threats are a style." Dorothy's breath caught. Harold made a low, wordless protest. Peter Telford stood very still, his gaze pinned not to Marjorie, but to the hook chalked on the barn floor, as if trying to understand how a human decision could be as simple as a hand moving down. Fenton opened his notebook again, slower this time. "We'll need more than talk." "You shall have it," Miss Marple said. She took from her pocket the blue-green twine and the card fragment. From the nail beam she plucked the tiny white curls of wax she'd disturbed, and from a scrap of rough cloth she unwrapped the little shard of green glass. "The stationer will remember the wax, Mr. Pym will identify Ashcombe's cord, and Mr. Crow's notebook, if you fetch it from his lodgings, will show Then a blot where he closed it as she approached. Marjorie's hand twitched, for the first time, not with grace but with haste. She looked to Harold, and what she offered him in that look was not love but arithmetic. Two people divided by one decision. He sank into a crate as if the wood had given way. "You dragged me into this," he said, almost wonderingly. "I dragged you up," she snapped, and the smoothness vanished. "I gave you a way out of Mother's—" She bit the word. Dorothy did not flinch. "Say it, child. Control. It keeps orchards alive." "It keeps men small," Marjorie said. Then, as if a curtain had fallen, and she did not care who saw behind it, she lifted her chin. "Yes, I met Crow. Yes, I warned him off at the fair with a taste that wasn't ours. He laughed at me. He said he'd talk to Dorothy and rearrange the household. So I rearranged something else. He was a greedy little man who thought he could put his hand in my pocket. He found my hook instead." Silence. Somewhere outside, a thrush sang 2 notes and then thought better of it. Fenton spoke first, voice clipped. "Marjorie Pell, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder." He began the words that must be said. They sounded very tired in the barn. Marjorie let out a breath that was not quite a sigh. "You'll make a meal of this," she told Miss Marple. "Old ladies do." Miss Marple's smile was soft and clear. "Only of apples, my dear. People give me indigestion." The constable led Marjorie away. Harold rose and took a step, as if to follow, then stopped, his courage running out at the threshold. Peter went to the door and stood aside for them all to pass, the schoolmaster in him neat even now. Nancy put her hand once on Dorothy's arm, solidarity, not comfort. Dorothy nodded, the lines of her face easing at last. Fenton lingered. He looked at the white ring of wax on the barrel head, and then at Miss Marple. "I'll admit," he said reluctantly, "I didn't see the trick with the clock." "It's a common one," she said. "Boys do it at school, men do it in business, women do it when men are watching where they're told." He made a note, perhaps to remind himself not to be told. When they were alone, Dorothy turned to Miss Marple, eyes bright with tired gratitude. "Jane," she said simply. Miss Marple patted her hand. "The orchard will do very well now. It has been pruned." They walked out together. The light had shifted. The rows of trees made long shadows like the ribs of a great green ship. Somewhere a gate clicked shut by an honest hand. Miss Marple paused and looked back at the barrels, the neat ranks, the calm order returning. "People may fuss," she said, the faintest humour at the edges of her voice, "and paper may lie, inspector may hurry, and brokers may boast, but apples—" She touched a russet in a crate with one gloved finger. "Apples never lie, they fall where they were grown." And so in the end, do people